It looks like it has started. Cuba has erupted in protests against the current communist government, and at exactly the same time, the director of the US Central Intelligence Agency unexpectedly appeared in Cuba. While the whole world was watching Beijing, where Trump and Xi Jinping were meeting, something happened in the Caribbean Sea that could potentially change the entire region. Mass protests have erupted in Cuba, events that were very hard to even imagine just 6 months ago. And at the same time, CIA Director John Radcliffe secretly flew to Havana to hold talks there. So let's analyze both events and, importantly, their connection. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel and like the video. And please leave any comment under this video. It really helps promote the content on YouTube. I would be very grateful to you for this, so that as many viewers as possible can see these episodes. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, in Cuba, popular protests against the communists in power have finally erupted. The Financial Times describes what is happening on the island as a massive energy collapse, due to a complete lack of fuel reserves. Power has gone out in almost all of the country's provinces. Just imagine, in Cuba, people are left without electricity for up to 22 hours a day. This isn't a temporary outage, it's not a rolling blackout. This is a systemic collapse, and it's already clear that there won't be any fuel. Since the US blockade is in full force, and even a Russian ship, by the way, recently couldn't enter a Cuban port. Cuba's Minister of Energy, Vicente de la Olevi, said something you don't often hear from a minister of a sitting government. And now I'll quote his words. He says, "We have absolutely no oil and absolutely no diesel fuel. We have no reserves." Yes, that's Cuba's Minister of Energy admitting that there are no reserves and that there's no bright future on the horizon. And the country's Minister of Energy publicly admits that the country has literally run out of fuel. Where did Cuba get its oil from in the first place? Well, let's remind ourselves, from Russia through some strange subsidized schemes, and the last Russian shipment was in March, and that's it. There haven't been any new oil shipments from Russia. In addition, Cuba received oil from Venezuela, which in turn was supported by Russia. But there too, at the beginning of the year, as you know, the tap was turned off after the overthrow of Nicolas Maduro's regime. Then Mexico. It tried to help Cuba, but the US blockade and tariff threats forced Mexico to stop helping Cuba. And that's it, Mexico doesn't supply oil either. As a result, Cuba was left without any fuel at all. And today, Trump mockingly said that now Cubans should prove that they are worthy of negotiations with Washington. And the consequences of all this are immediate. This is how the Financial Times describes the protest in Cuba. People were banging pots and pans because due to constant blackouts, even food distribution was affected. The government's allocation of food turned out to be unstable. You might say, what's the big deal about banging pots and pans? I want to emphasize this is Cuba, where it was hard to even imagine something like this. Let's move on. Protesters were burning barricades on the roads and the police were trying to calm the crowd. There are already reports of the first clashes. And now imagine, there is no fuel on the official market in Cuba. Here the Minister of Energy says, there is no fuel, there are no reserves, nothing. But there is a black market, and on the black market in Cuba, the price of gasoline is $8 per liter. But here's the problem. In Cuba, the average salary is about $30 a month. That means with your entire monthly salary, you can buy just 3.5 liters of gasoline on the black market. But then, an interesting detail suddenly emerges in this story. It's reported that the CIA director visits Cuba for a rare meeting while the island is left without fuel. What's going on? John Radcliffe, the CIA director, led the American delegation during an unexpected visit to Havana. Reportedly, he met with Raul Castro's grandson, known as Raulito, in an extremely unusual meeting. Representatives of the Cuban Ministry of Internal Affairs also participated in the negotiations. But the whole point is that suddenly it was people from the CIA who were the ones handling the negotiations. The Cuban authorities only stated, quote, both sides emphasized their interest in developing bilateral cooperation between law enforcement agencies in the interests of the security of both countries, as well as regional and international security. And the key point that Havana put forward during the meeting, quote, Cuba does not pose a threat to the national security of the United States. This is a very important statement. If Havana states that this is exactly what was said during the negotiations with the CIA director, then this is the statement. And it was the subject of discussion. Let me remind you that the Americans openly say that Cuba really poses a threat to the United States of America. And the very fact that they started discussing this is already a signal. Because Trump himself hinted a few days ago that the US and Cuba are planning to talk to each other. And they are going to discuss, for example, the influence of Russia or China on the island. So you could say that things seem to be moving even faster than expected. Some people believed Cuba would find fuel elsewhere, so the blackmail wouldn't succeed. Now, the main question is, what's happening in Cuba today? Is this a CIA operation or a peculiar kind of diplomacy? Well, the honest answer is that it's both at the same time. The US never sends the CIA director instead of the Secretary of State or some diplomat to negotiations that are purely humanitarian in nature. If an agreement needs to be reached, it can be done. Politically, the CIA director simply won't attend. The CIA deals with intelligence, covert operations, and negotiations in places where diplomacy hasn't officially started yet, as a rule. So, there are these behind-the-scenes negotiations going on so that later official diplomats can pick them up. It's, a kind of probing and testing the waters. What do the US want from Cuba? Several things. First, a break with the Russians. Cuba has become a transit point for Russian influence in Latin America. If the oil runs out and Moscow doesn't supply it, Havana is vulnerable, and this is an opportunity for Washington. The second is the cessation of Russian military facilities in Cuba, including the Signals Intelligence Station in Lourdes. Third, possibly negotiations about the fate of Cuban political prisoners, which is demanded by human rights activists and Cuban congressmen from Florida. What does Cuba want? Cuba, of course, wants fuel. Cuba wants the lifting of sanctions. Cuba wants to breathe after decades of economic blockade. And if Russia can no longer supply oil, Venezuela can't, Mexico can't, no one can, there's only one alternative here. And this alternative arrived on an American government plane at Havana Airport. Well, I think you understand what the hint is. The Americans are saying, we'll give you more than enough fuel. And here it's important to remember that the US has already basically squeezed out Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela, replacing him with a pro-American administration. Now it's Cuba's turn, and this is not a coincidence. It's a consistent strategy. Well, let's see what comes out of this now. Now it's very important to watch, because the negotiations have already started, and you see at what level, so there will definitely be some kind of outcome. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or a paid channel membership using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourself. Goodbye, everyone.